Deadboat by Anthony D Redden. Published by KYANITE Publishing. Read by the author. Chapter 1. The air was stale. Small caged pyres burned the worthless belongings of previous inmates that had since been ushered to their death upon the gallows of Old Town. Groups of men and children huddled around the glowing embers, trying to warm themselves against the bitter November chill. In the distance, bell tolls from the church reminded those who still cared that people were going to die today, and tomorrow, and the next day. People never stayed around for long after the governor had condemned them, and the governor tended to condemn everyone that stood before him. Spain of 1726 was a terrible place to live, but a far worse place to die. As the jailer struggled with the aged lock and forcefully swung open the cell door, everyone seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. The large Neanderthal of a man stepped into the room and proceeded to hack up phlegm before spitting carelessly into the crowd of silent onlookers. The thought of rushing the jailer and breaking away to freedom had long since been eroded from the thoughts of the inmates, who had now come to mostly accept their fate. The jailer paused for a moment, contemplating his next move, then gave a huge sigh and plodded further into the squalor. Two rough-looking, heavy-set guards followed him in and stood by his side, waiting silently for their superior to make some gesture or command. The jailer slowly scanned the room, a look of disgust upon his old, weathered face. "Who wants to hang today?" he asked the room. Everyone could instantly feel their hearts and stomachs drop, though this daily routine was a familiar and tiresome affair. The jailer walked up to one of the pyres, stretched out his hands and rubbed them together to warm himself. His movements sent wafts of smoke spiraling through the cell, small particles of ash and glowing embers fluttering around in the air like dying fireflies. "Well?" Nobody answered. Heads hung low in his presence, and the inmates' eyes had all closed, willing him to leave, hoping they would not be selected today. The jailer glanced back at his colleagues and casually gestured for them to move in. The two men obliged and instantly began dragging random people to their feet for scrutiny. "I need 8 volunteers, 8! That's all. The rest of you can have a day's reprieve." Again, nobody answered. By this time the two guards had roused a dozen men and children, who were each standing silently in line against the wall. The jailer turned and wandered up to them. He briefly looked them over, and rubbing his chin in contemplation, he pointed to 8 placed at random intervals down the line. The others quickly slumped back to the cold, wet, cobbled floor. "Thank you for volunteering," he announced to them with a smirk upon his face. Another gesture to his colleagues, and they were ushered roughly from the room. The jailer hacked up another throatful of phlegm and spat it into the pyre's dull flames, causing it to sizzle and crack. He turned and followed the guards from the room. "I'll be seeing you soon," he promised the remaining inmates. The heavy door was slammed shut behind him, and the jailer again struggled with the rusted iron lock until it clunked securely shut. In the corridor, the 8 unwilling volunteers stood in single file. Despite their common predicament, none of them knew any other, except for a father and his young son. The boy was no more than 8 years old, and he huddled close to his father's leg as his father wrapped a reassuring arm around his shoulders. The condemned cell wasn't a place for socializing. Most inhabitants didn't feel like making acquaintances. Amongst the gathering was Harvey, the son of a fishmonger, tall and lean and 16 years of age. He wore a tatty linen shirt and a tight leather-hide waistcoat with matching jodhpurs. He was soaked from dampness and sweat, as were all his companions, and still carried the pungent stench of his trade, masked only slightly by the smoke and ash that had created a layer of soot upon his skin, clogging his pores, disguising his fair hair and paleness, making him a generic inmate. He looked the same as any other man or child in Old Town Jail, just another nobody, soon to be cast into a mass, unmarked grave and left there to rot, all the nobodies together. "Right, the governor wants to see you lot personally." The head jailer's tone was gruff, yet slightly jovial. "But first, you all need a bloody wash. There ain't no way the governor wants you lot trampling over his rugs, dirtying his office with your filth." The jailer gestured towards his colleagues, whom nodded back, and began manhandling the group of 8 down the corridor. "Enjoy it. It'll be the last wash you get," he shouted with a laugh at the solemn group as they were led away. 20 minutes later, everyone was again standing in line, this time outside the governor's office. Much of the grime and dirt had been forcefully scrubbed away by the overzealous prison guards, the rough treatment leaving fresh bruises and red raw skin. They were, however, now all distinguishable from each other. Their wet clothes had been stripped from them and replaced by dry Hessian smocks. It wasn't long before they were marched barefoot through the large ornate office doors of the governor. The man that greeted them all was large and elderly. He stood at an intimidating height, dressed in a pristine suit and holding a beautifully crafted ivory walking cane. He stood by a large wooden desk and a quaint open fireplace. He placed his half-drunk glass of brandy upon the mantel before turning to face the group of convicts. No introductions were needed. "Who here wishes to die today, huh?" No response. The father tightened the reassuring grip upon his young son's shoulder as the governor chuckled to himself. He cast a cursory glance over the gathering in front of him, then swept back his jacket tails to reveal a pistol in a side holster. His hand gripped the gun, and he swiftly slid it free to point it at the head of the father. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. Gunpowder cracked through the air and he sent the man flailing backwards to the floor. The smoke cloud quickly dissipated, leaving a room of shock and blood splatters. The son fell to his father's side, cradling his crippled form and screaming uncontrollably. The governor gestured to one of his guards, who nodded back before removing a pistol of his own and pointing it at the young boy's head. He then released a round of lead that left the child's body as limp and lifeless as his father's. The second cloud of smoke also dissipated, leaving the room now trembling and holding their breaths. The governor replaced his weapon and took another sip of brandy. Moments dragged until he, at last, addressed the group once again. "I do not care about you." The old man strolled before the inmates like a sergeant major on parade, inspecting his line of troops. "I do not want to know your name, where you're from, or why you're here. I really do not give a damn. A father and son's brains now decorate my floor for no other reason than to prove to you how little all of you mean to me. And that when I say that you will die, you know that I mean it." All eyes remained cast at the floor, though all ears were attentive with apprehension. "I have a proposition for you all, a very simple choice. The first option is that the remaining 6 of you will navigate a ship back to England, whereupon you will receive a full pardon for your crimes and become free men. The second option is that you die today upon the gallows. The 6 prisoners all looked to the governor now, an air of confusion and anxiety buzzing between them. The possibility of freedom, the chance of escaping the noose. None of the 6 were sailors, let alone in possession of the know-how to navigate a ship to England, but that seemed a trivial fact when accepting the offer meant the possibility of going home alive. So unless there are any objections, your ship awaits, the governor stated. There came no response. Good.